Hello and welcome to a new episode of Computationally Yours, where the conversations begin at computational biology. I'm your host, Dr. Sabah Kadri.
And I am Arshi Arora. You are listening to Computationally Yours.
Our mission here is to make science and advanced topics in computational biology more accessible.
Speaking of which, have you ever wondered that how does research from scientific laboratories make it all the way to the pharmacies? How do we assess behavior of such a drug? And lastly, how do we do this in an ethical and unbiased manner? To understand this process better, today we will be covering clinical trials.
Yeah, Shri, there has been so much conversation about clinical trials recently. There has been talk about phase one, phase two, approval of drugs, emergency approvals, positive results, and all these buzzwords. So we thought, why not define these clinical trials for you? What is a clinical trial? What does the life cycle of a clinical trial look like? Some important terminology related to them. And for that, today, Arshi is going to give me and our listeners a crash course in clinical trials.
In the end, we will also try to go over a published trial and share some resources with you. All this will be listed in our website, so go ahead and check it out.
Please note that this is episode 1 in a two-part series about clinical trials, where next week we are going to be talking to an expert about clinical trials in infectious diseases.
I would also like to tell you one thing. While we were putting this episode together, we found something really interesting. And that is that May 20th is actually the International Clinical Trials Day. And our second episode will coincide with May 20th. Isn't the timing quite perfect there?
I know, we totally did not plan it, but it so seems like we did.
Clinical Trials 101 coming right up.
All right, so first things first. Arshi, why don't you get us started with what are clinical trials and why do we conduct them?
Yes, it's a great place to start, Sabah. Let's answer the why first. We need clinical trials to bring in new treatments or therapies to market. And we need to do this in a way where we know how safe they are and how good they are. And we need to do all of this in an unbiased manner. In fact, the whole field of clinical and translation research at this point is asking how can we move interventions from bench to bedside, from getting the scientific discoveries from the lab to your home. And they achieve this by doing research and finally implementing an approved clinical trial.
I see. So, what you're saying is that new drugs and treatments only come into our daily lives after they've been through this whole process of clinical trials.
Exactly. That's very important. So, just to answer the what first in a more formalized manner, a clinical trial in its essence is an experiment, and it's an experiment which is going to compare the effect and value of interventions against a control in human beings. And this type of an intervention can be medical, surgical, or behavioral. Sabah, do you want to share one with us?
Right. So Arshi gave me homework for today. She asked me to look into some examples of clinical trials. So I know Arshi, you asked me for one, but I looked up a couple of them. Usually, when you think of clinical trials, you think of just a drug. But even medical devices undergo clinical trials. So I found a paper on a dental X-ray unit. I'm going to share that on the website as well. And the one that was, I guess, a very popular trial, which is the comparison of warfarin and aspirin for the prevention and recurrence of stroke. I think they call it the WARS trial, WARSS trial. However, when I was looking into this, I found a very interesting tidbit, which was the very first controlled clinical trial ever conducted in the modern era. Are you ready for it, Arshi?
Yes, I am. I really want to know what you found out.
Okay, so in 1747, there was a Scottish physician called Dr. James Lind, and he was treating crew members on this British naval ship. They were experiencing scurvy, and he was trying to figure out different treatments for them. And as we all know, citrus fruits are a good treatment for scurvy. He actually discovered this on that ship, and in the modern era, this is recorded to be the first physician to have conducted a controlled clinical trial. And in the honor of this particular clinical trial, May 20th is known as International Clinical Trials Day. So When you mentioned that, I actually knew that. I was holding this information out for you.
This is a really interesting fact. I had no idea that it went as far behind as in 1740s.
Yeah, I thought this was very cool, so I thought I would keep this as a fun fact for our listeners. Anyway, so those are the examples that I found for my homework. Did I do well, Arshi?
Oh, you did very well. I think the example you gave of the WARS trial, which is the warfarin and aspirin trial, I was actually planning to talk about it later in the episode, giving another example of it. So we're right on track. But I would like to mention a few things here. Although this quest for finding new and effective treatments and cure of disease, it sounds like a noble goal, and it is, don't get me wrong there. But one also needs to consider the potential risks to people who are involved in this journey. And especially, we all know that after the period of very reproachful or unethical human experimentation on World War II prisoners, the scientific community started coming up with an ethical framework for medical research, and the basic moral principles need to be put whenever there are human subjects involved. Some of them are the Declaration of Helsinki or the Belmont Report, to name a few. I'm going to post some links about these on our website for more detail if the listeners are interested.
So that's been a bit of a history lesson from both of us. Let's start talking about the present then. So let's talk about the current process of clinical trials now. There are 3 phases of clinical trials. Let's talk more about that. Could you elaborate for us what those phases are?
Absolutely. And you are right that there are 3 phases of clinical trials. But you just don't come and start with phase 1 of the clinical trial. What is happening in the background is the phase 0, where researchers just put in years and years of work researching and knowing the foundation of a problem. So once you have that whole foundation and that groundwork set up, that's when you actually start with phase 1 of a clinical trial.
Okay, so basically what you're saying is that there are 4 phases, not 3.
Yeah, you can say that. So, anyways, coming back to a more formalized clinical trial life cycle, you're right. The clinical trial has 3 phases. Each phase assesses different questions in an increasing number of sample population. So, if you just see in phase 1, in phase 2, and phase 3, you're going to keep on accruing an increasing number of patients. So, the number of samples and objectives at a granular level may vary according to the intervention. So it's not a fixed number of samples that you're supposed to have in phase 1. It can vary according to the intervention or the type of clinical trial. But very, very broadly speaking, phase 1 is trying to answer that whether the drug is safe for humans or not. Period. That's it. So what the phase 1 will try to assess is the safety of this new chemical compound. And since this is the very first phase, we are also trying to answer at what dose level is it safe for humans, right? So we need to answer both the questions. And this actually formally defined is a maximum tolerated dose. One different thing about phase 1 is that it can be tested in normal as well as deceased patients. Again, it all depends on the type of intervention and the clinical trial you have. But typically, in a phase 1 trial, you can about recruit 10 to 80 of patients in the phase 1 trial. And then once we have the preliminary evidence indicating that the chemical compound is safe at an MTD level, which is the maximum tolerated dose in humans, that's when we move to phase 2.
Okay, that makes a lot of sense. So, since the drug has never been tested before, one of the primary objectives here is to test for safety in phase 1. But Arshi, you used a term there. You used MTD, maximum tolerated dose. Could you just elaborate slightly on what that is?
Absolutely, Sabah. So the maximum tolerated dose, or MTD, as the name says, it's the maximum dose that we can give to a patient without them showing any unacceptable side effects. So in phase 1 trial, they're trying to increase the dose a little bit, one at a time, to see what is this maximum dose at which we don't see any unacceptable side effect.
Got it. Okay, please go on.
After this phase 1 trial, we are still not very sure that whether this is good enough for a treatment decision yet. So that's where the goal of phase 2 comes in. So the goal of phase 2 is still to test again whether it is still safe in a wider population, and is there any primary evidence that this new intervention may benefit patients with respect to our outcome that we have in mind. In phase 2, the sample size is about a couple of hundred.
So you're saying that at this point in phase 2, there's still not adequate evidence to change the clinical practice completely with whatever this intervention is. So you could say phase 2 provides a go, no go decision for phase 3 then?
That's very well put. Phase 2 determines whether we proceed to phase 3 or not. So let me tell you about these phase 3 trials. So the phase 3 trials are more frequently reported in media and published in journals as well. And they're known as the phase 3 randomized clinical trials. So the goal here is now to design and conduct a decisive clinical trial, one that will change clinical practice. So now we're ready to conduct a trial which can actually come into clinical practice. These type of trials, they are often double-blinded and they're multi-center so that we can accrue patients across a wider area. And they include patient accrual rates ranging from 300 to 3,000 patients or even more. Again, it depends on the type of trial you have and type of study you have in mind. They are designed with a particular and primary question in mind. So let me give you an example of the WARS trial that you mentioned before. This WARS trial was a phase 3 trial. It was multi-center, it was double-blinded, and it was a randomized trial. And what were they trying to do? As I said, every trial has an objective. They were trying to compare whether the effect of warfarin or that of aspirin on the combined primary endpoint of recurrent stroke or death from any cause within these 2 years.
So I think it would be nice if you explain double-blinded, because I think double-blinded is a word that's also been coming out in the news a lot. So could you talk about what that is?
Yeah, that's a great place to start again. There are physicians who are administering the treatment and there are patients who are receiving the treatment. So in the double-blinded, we mean that the participants and the physicians, they are not aware of the intervention or the therapy that is getting used. So neither the physician knows nor the patient knows.
I see. So double-blinded is when both the physician as well as the patient are blinded to what treatment group that patient belongs to in that trial.
And why is this important? We're going to talk more about this in our next episode, but very quickly, this double-blinded trial is very important because it controls for various biases. One of the very important bias that it corrects for is the placebo effect. And it does not let the study or personnel involved, they don't get influenced in any way. In an emergency, the researchers can actually find out which trial group a patient was in. But in general, no one knows until the trial has finished.
I see. And Arshi, are all trials double-blinded?
No, so all trials are not double-blinded. It might vary on what type of treatment effect you're trying to assess and what type of treatments you have in mind to assess your intervention with. So it might vary with that.
So, before we go further, I want to come back to another term that you used. You mentioned something about biases. So, how are these biases addressed?
So biases actually, once if we are making a decision on a treatment, we need to make sure that we have addressed all these biases carefully. So as I said, clinical trials are always in the future. They are prospective. So patients are accrued as they become eligible and not the other way around, right? You don't first start a treatment on a patient and then put them to a clinical trial. They are accrued as they become eligible. So this takes care of recall and selection bias. You cannot just select patients and then tell them, oh, they're eligible for a clinical trial. Another bias is the treatment bias, which is a big part of clinical trial statistical analysis, is the intent to treat analysis, which takes care of this treatment bias. And as we mentioned before, the randomized clinical trial in the phase 3, they actually assure that the patients are followed up to a certain time. And also, since they are randomized, we mean that the randomization in the patients that make sure that the study groups are similar with respect to baseline risk factors.
Interesting. It's really good to know that these treatments go through so many processes before they go into practice. I do have another question for you. Now, I can imagine that once you go through a clinical trial, not all trials are going to yield successful results. Sometimes a trial will show that the treatment or the drug is not working as well. So, what happens in those cases? Are those cases still published or do people just ignore them?
That's a very important and a crucial point we've come to in this episode. Phase 3 trials, whether it is showing successful results or not, they do get published. I'm going to give you an example of a surgical clinical trial. So this clinical trial, which I'm going to reference later, is a knee surgery trial. So in this clinical trial, we had 180 patients who suffered from osteoarthritis of the knee, and they were randomly assigned to receive either arthroscopic treatments or a placebo surgery. So obviously, it's not a double-blinded study. The physician knew what type of treatment to administer to the patient. It was single-blinded in the sense that patients didn't know which treatment they were receiving. In the results, at no point either of the interventions reported less pain or better function than the placebo group.
Oh, so that is a really good example. It is really important to know when the treatments have done better, and also it is important to know when the treatments have not done better than the placebo, better than no treatment at all. So, Arshi, could you briefly talk about how clinical trials are designed? I know it's probably a very big question, but if you could just briefly enlighten us.
Yeah, so designing a clinical trial is a laborious task. Before a clinical trial can actually start, before you can actually start trying your new interventions, you need to make sure that the clinical trial is approved. Now, what happens when you're designing a clinical trial? You have to, first of all, have a research question in mind, which you want to test for. So, a question or a hypothesis which is coming from these years of research work. Then the next thing you have to do is that you need to come up with the patient eligibility criteria and what patients you want to try to test your treatment in. Once you have that figured out, you also need to make sure that you have the consent form from the patients to start a clinical trial. More importantly is the statistical analysis that goes into the clinical trial. All this is under a statistical analysis plan. That's the actual term for a clinical trial. And this covers a bunch of questions like the trial length, how many samples to accrue. And the samples to accrue is a question which you need to figure out before starting a trial, because for this you need to know what's the incidence rate of the disease, and the sample size also need to account for the dropouts to observe a desired effect size. So in a nutshell is what I'm telling you, but a lot of stuff is going on behind designing a clinical trial.
You're right. We would probably have to delve into the design of a clinical trial more deeply later, but that was a really good summary. So, you mentioned something very interesting. So, you said that the clinical trial needs to be approved first. No one can just randomly start a clinical trial at their hospital. So, can you comment on that process? How do you get a clinical trial approved and by whom?
Yeah, that's a really important bit, Sabah. So, the critical aspect of clinical trial is that they are performed on humans. We need to be very sure that we are protecting the rights and the welfare of human beings that are involved in these clinical trials and that they are subjected to ethical standards. So, to ensure all of that, all trials are approved by IRB or your institutional review board, or there is ISC body, which is the Independent Ethics Committee. In fact, apart from getting the trial approved, even if you need to modify your trial, you need to seek an approval from the IRB. And in that sense, IRB is an independent body that is closely involved with the trial apart from the physician and the patient.
Ah, I see. So that's why it takes so long to conduct these clinical trials because there's so much work going into all of them. You're coming up with initial research, setting up a team of clinicians and biostatisticians, then you're finally recruiting the patients across different centers in many cases, depending on the prevalence of the disease. And then you're finally following up with the patients. So, this could take years, I imagine, and millions of dollars in order to see a clinical trial to its fruition.
Yep, you're absolutely right, Sabah. So the follow-up bit is a very crucial bit. Say if you were accruing patients for 3 years, and then once you are performing the clinical trial, you also need to see how they are doing after the treatment. And that can actually range from 3 to 5 years. So say if your initial patient accrual was 3 years and then you decide to follow them up for another 3 years, that's 6 years there without even analyzing the clinical trial.
I see. Another thing that we hear a lot is a therapy or a drug or a treatment gets approved by the FDA. When does the FDA come in this entire process?
So, after you have shown that your phase 3 results are successful and it makes sense to now administer this intervention, and when you actually need to bring it into clinical practice, that's when you approach the FDA. And in that sense, so after all the clinical trial analysis, when we have confidently established that our intervention has reached the primary objective, you apply for an FDA approval, the Food and Drug Administration, or if you're in the Europe, it's the European Medicines Agency. Couple of statistics that I want to give everyone out there is that this process is a long process. Only 60% of the phase 1 trials move to phase 2 trial. And then from phase 2 trial, only 20% go to phase 3. And out of this, only 10% of the drugs are approved by the FDA.
Oh, wow. Arshi, you mentioned that this approval process is a long process with the FDA. What happens in an emergency situation? What if you don't have that length of time to get the drug approved from the FDA? Is there any way to expedite it?
Yep, you're absolutely right. There are all types of contingencies in the FDA. I know we are facing one scenario right now, but it's a serious condition and we have a big gap in the medical need that is unmet. We have various expedite programs that lead to accelerated approvals, given that you're warranting everything is safe and done in an ethical manner.
All right. Thank you, Arshi, so much for that really detailed explanation of a clinical trial and its life cycle. However, we cannot end this episode without me asking you, what is the one thing that you would want the listeners to walk away with today from this episode?
One take-home message that I would like to give is that clinical trials, they are time consuming, they are expensive, and they are laborious on behalf of the people involved, name it be patients, physicians, nurses, data managers, and statisticians, to name a few.
And that brings us to the end of our third episode. Do send us an email with questions and feedback. Our email is computationallyyours@gmail.com. You can see it in the description below. Our Twitter handle is @compbiopodcast. You can also see the video version of this podcast on YouTube. The channel link is below. All episodes are posted on YouTube with a 1-week delay. And of course, do not miss subscribing to us. And until next time,
this is Computationally Yours.